Verse 120. My flesh trembles in fear of you, I stand in awe of your laws. Explanation. The psalmist expresses a deep reverence for God and his laws, acknowledging God's power and holiness. Verse 121. I have done what is righteous and just, do not leave me to my oppressors. Explanation. The psalmist affirms his commitment to righteousness and asks for God's protection from those who would harm him. Before moving forward, do subscribe to my channel. Verse 122. Ensure your servant's well-being, do not let the arrogant oppress me. Explanation. The psalmist seeks God's favor and protection from the proud and arrogant. Verse 123. My eyes fail, looking for your salvation, looking for your righteous promise. Explanation. The psalmist expresses a longing for God's salvation and the fulfillment of his promises. Verse 124. Deal with your servant according to your love and teach me your decrees. Explanation. The psalmist asks for God's mercy and instruction in his decrees. Verse 125. I am your servant, give me discernment that I may understand your statutes. Explanation. The psalmist acknowledges his role as a servant of God and asks for understanding of his statutes. Verse 126. It is time for you to act, Lord, your law is being broken. Explanation. The psalmist calls on God to intervene when his law is being violated. Verse 127. Because I love your commands more than gold, more than pure gold. Explanation. The psalmist expresses a deep love for God's commands, valuing them above material wealth. Verse 128. And because I consider all your precepts right, I hate every wrong path. Explanation. The psalmist affirms his belief in the righteousness of God's precepts and his hatred for evil. Verse 129. Your statutes are wonderful, therefore I obey them. Explanation. The psalmist expresses admiration for God's statutes and his commitment to obeying them. Verse 130. The unfolding of your words gives light, it gives understanding to the simple. Explanation. The psalmist highlights the illuminating power of God's word, bringing understanding even to those who are simple. Verse 131. I open my mouth and pant, longing for your commands. Explanation. The psalmist expresses a deep desire for God's commands, like someone panting for water. Verse 132. Turn to me and have mercy on me, as you always do to those who love your name. Explanation. The psalmist asks for God's mercy and favor, as he always shows to those who love him. Verse 133. Direct my footsteps according to your word, let no sin rule over me. Meaning, the psalmist asks for God's guidance in living according to his word and for protection from sin. Verse 134. Redeem me from human oppression, that I may obey your precepts. Explanation. The psalmist seeks God's deliverance from oppression so that he can freely obey his precepts. Verse 135. Make your face shine on your servant and teach me your decrees. Explanation. The psalmist asks for God's presence and instruction in his decrees. Verse 136. Streams of tears flow from my eyes, for your law is not obeyed. Explanation. The psalmist expresses sorrow for the disobedience to God's law in the world. Verse 137. You are righteous, Lord, and your laws are right. Explanation. The psalmist affirms the righteousness of God and his laws. Verse 138. The statutes you have laid down are righteous, they are fully trustworthy. Explanation. The psalmist emphasizes the trustworthiness of God's statutes. Verse 139. My zeal wears me out, for my enemies ignore your words. Explanation. The psalmist's passion for God's word consumes him as he sees it being ignored by his enemies. Verse 140. Your promises have been thoroughly tested, and your servant loves them. Explanation. The psalmist expresses his love for God's promises, which have proven to be true. Now how we can use these verses in our daily life. Daily life. This reminds us to approach God with humility and respect, recognizing his authority in our lives. We should strive to live righteously and trust that God will protect us in times of trouble. We can ask God to guide us and protect us from those who are prideful and seek to harm others. We should recognize our role as servants of God and seek to understand his will for our lives. We can pray for God's justice to prevail in the world and for his law to be upheld. We should prioritize our love for God's commands above worldly possessions and desires. We should find joy in God's statutes and seek to obey them in our daily lives. We should study God's word regularly, allowing it to illuminate our minds and give us understanding. We can approach God with confidence, knowing that He is merciful to those who love Him.